to congratulate the organizers, Christos and the team, that you, in a very short duration, you guys put together what looks like a very stellar conference. I'm sorry that I couldn't attend the earlier talks because of the time difference, and I look forward to, I suspect there will be a recording afterwards, and I would like to see the other presentations as well. So I looked at the schedule, and there were a host of papers which were assessing the economic consequences of COVID-19, and also how the policies that were enacted, how did they affect various outcomes. So in this paper, we look at possibly an unintended consequence of these.
You're slightly breaking up, Rohit. Maybe the microphone.
Is it better?
Go on again, please.
Can everyone hear me?
You break up. No. Try again, please.
Let me mute and hello?
Yes.
Okay, is it better?
I think it's better now, yes, please.
Right. So in this paper, we assess unintended consequence of shutdown policies, especially we focus on how these shutdown policies may have affected conflicts globally. This paper is co-authored with Nicola Berman, Matthew Coutinier, and Natalie Manet. So the motivation in this paper, we ask how these restriction measures may have affected conflict incidents across worldwide, and the motivation came from a host of anecdotal evidence that for example, in North America and Central America, one observed that there was a sharp decline in violence in major cities following these lockdown policies. And then in India, we observed that a major nationwide protest, which had been ongoing for months against the mistreatment of minorities, it suddenly came to an end once the shutdown policy was implemented. However, at the same time, we also observed that there were incidences of rising scapegoating of minorities. In India and Bangladesh, there were cases where minorities were accused of spreading coronavirus, and they were targeted specifically. And then you also saw some authoritarian regimes using the global preoccupation with COVID-19 as an opportunity to quell opposition. You saw some examples in Myanmar, and then in countries like Azerbaijan, where even legitimate democratic opposition was stifled. So one can think of various mechanisms through which these lockdown policies may have affected global conflicts. One mechanism which comes from the literature on organization of protests is that these policies may increase the individual cost of participation, but there is a moral hazard problem that while these costs are observed individually, but the gains, any benefit that might come out of protest outcomes are distributed even to the non-participants. And the second, a priori, there could also be certain income shocks, which might also affect conflict outcomes. For example, there might be these negative income shocks may reduce the opportunity cost of people to engage in conflict, as well as it reduces the state capacity to quell or stifle any kind of opposition. On the other hand, it also reduces the attractiveness of states as prizes, so this might also impact any kind of rebel activity to capture or engage in conflict. So what do we do in this paper? We look at real-time evidence or daily evidence on how enforcing these restriction policies affected conflicts globally. We assess the conflict dynamics and how they may vary across different kinds of events and actors. And finally, we also assess how these lockdown policies may have affected conflicts depending on local socio or country level socioeconomic context. So we make use of two crucial data sets. One, we use ACLED, which is Armed Conflict Location and Event Dataset, which provides daily information on conflicts globally. It has information on the date, the day of the event, who are the actors who are participating in conflict, and finally, the different kinds of other types of events which the actors were participating in. Second, we also take advantage of Oxford COVID-19 response tracker, which they put together, where they put information on how countries impose policies to restrict spread of COVID-19, which it includes information such as closing of workplaces and schools, restriction on internal movements, or restriction on any kind of organizational activity or organizing of populations outside. So the main result that emerges from our analysis, we find that when countries impose a nationwide restriction on mobility, it reduces the likelihood of daily conflict by 9 percentage points. Next, we assess the dynamic of the impact of these lockdown policies, and we find this reduction is progressive. We find that even 3 to 4 weeks after these policies were implemented, there was a substantial decline in the probability of conflict events. Then we look at, when we parse the data and look at the type of events that get affected by lockdown policies, we find that this reduction is significant in the case of protest activity, as well as in cases of violence against civilians. Finally, when we parse the effect on the basis of the actors that were involved in these conflict events, we find that the reduction of conflict is severest for events that involve, once again, protesters or civilians. However, we don't find any kind of effect when it comes to conflict events involving state forces or rebel groups. Finally, we also look at certain country characteristics to identify which features might be mediating the effect of these restriction policies on conflict dynamics. We find that countries, poor countries, in poor countries, there is no significant decrease in conflict outcomes. And this effect is mostly driven by not much decline in protest activity, which suggests that there might actually be some kind of increase in protests due to these implementation of lockdown policies in poor countries. Furthermore, we also find that in countries with high religious fractionalization, once again, there is no major decline in conflict. Once again, this effect is mediated by events which involve civilians, and we suggest that this could be hinting towards a scapegoating narrative that minorities might be targeted in countries which are highly religiously fractionalized. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about the data. Christos, how much time do I have?
Just a sec. You have about 15 minutes.
15, okay.
5.
So just to talk a bit about the data. First of all, we compile a daily incidence of conflicts, which comes from ACLED. We collect data on daily incidents from January 1st, 2016 to April 18th, 2020. Once again, as I suggested, that it is a daily information where we have the number of events that took place within country I per day. We also have information on the types of events that different actors engaged in. For example, we have information that identifies whether this conflict event related to battles between groups, whether it was a protest activity, some rioting activity, or it involved certain groups conducting violence against unarmed civilians. Then again, we can also parse through this data set, we can parse information on conflict depending on who are the actors that were involved in the conflict activity. For example, we can identify whether the conflict involved state forces, whether they involved rebel militias, or they just involved protesters or civilians. So let me show you just a trend of how the conflict activity has evolved since 2019. You can see that somewhere by mid-March, that's when countries started to impose lockdown policies worldwide. You see there's a substantial decline in conflict events in the imposition of these measures. This effect is mostly driven by a significant decline in protest activity across countries. On the other hand, you also see some rise in events of conflict that were due to some kind of that were related to some COVID event, for example, protesters or individuals being targeted for spreading COVID-19. Next, we use the Oxford Tracker to put together how daily events of how countries introduce policies to curb COVID-19. This tracker has 8 different measures of public policies to restrict COVID-19, which ranges from closing of schools, having some kind of restriction on workplace and public transport, some kind of travel restrictions, as well as limitations on public gatherings and stay-at-home requirements. So we use this data to create 3 different measures of COVID-19 policy measures. One is just a binary restriction, which takes a value of 1 if a country had nationally imposed an order which entailed closing of schools and workplace and any restriction on internal movement. Then we also have some kind of index measures where we also look at the intensity of these measures. For example, whether they were imposed regionally or nationally, or how severe they were in terms of their imposition. And we also create these kind of index measures to see how the severity of these indices of these policies affect conflict. So in our empirical setup, this is the only equation I'll show. We test how restriction policies that were implemented in country I at day T had a contemporaneous effect on conflict outcomes in country I in that time. We control for country level fixed effects or monthly and year-month fixed effects to control for any unobserved country level features, as well as any kind of time shocks in our setup. And we estimate this regression based on both a linear probability model when we test a binary outcome, as well as a Poisson pseudo-maximal likelihood estimator when we have conflict as a continuous measure number of events. All right, so here is the main result. In column 1, this result tells you that if from the day when a country imposed a policy nationwide lockdown measure, there was a decline in daily protests or daily conflict incidents by 9 percentage points. In column 2,
you're breaking up. You're breaking up, Rohit. Yeah, you're drifting in and out. Can you adjust maybe the mic?
Hi, is it better?
Yeah, much better now.
So in column 2, we instead of we now have a continuous measure of conflict events, and this the coefficient of 0.27 suggests that there is a decline of 6.5% in daily number of conflict events following the position of these policy restrictions. Column 3 and 4, we use these measures instead of a binary outcome, and we find again a robust decline in conflict events, depending on the severity of these measures. Finally, in column 5, we conduct a thought exercise, considering that countries which have low level of press freedom might also exhibit bias in the reportage of conflict events. In this case, we might overestimate the effect of these lockdown policies on conflict outcomes. So in column five, we interact our policy measures with a measure of freedom index, which measures the quality of press freedom in a country I prior to imposition of the lockdown. And basically, we find no evidence of countries with more restrictive press freedom having an effect on the reportage of conflict outcomes. Now, we also look at the conflict dynamics, where we introduce daily leads and lags, and we estimate how these dynamics evolved 3 weeks prior to imposition of a lockdown policy, as well as 4 weeks afterwards. So the graph shows you that already a week prior to imposing a lockdown policy, there was a significant decline in conflict incidents, which suggests that people were already adjusting to the possible lockdown being imposed. However, we also find that following the lockdown, there's a continuous decline in conflict incidents, and the effect is most severest 3 to 4 weeks after the lockdown policy was imposed.
Rohit, still the sound is not great. Can you maybe adjust again, please?
I'm very close to the mic.
Sometimes the sound is fantastic. Now it's better. Yes.
Okay. All right. So next we look at across different event types and see which kind of events were most affected by introduction of these lockdown policies.
No, there's a problem with the sound, I'm afraid. No, we lost you completely now, Rohit. At least I have. Yeah, I've lost you completely. I don't think you're coming through.
Hello? Is it?
Try again, please.
Hello?
Try again.
Hello?
I think you are drifting in and out. When you say hello, is fine, but then when you say something else after that, it's not.
So, can you hear me?
Not really.
I really apologize. I don't know why the mic.
Well, these things happen, I guess. Is there anything you can adjust? No, maybe I don't know. I don't know what to suggest.
I don't know. I'm really close to the mic. I'm not sure.
That's really clear.
Yeah, that was clear.
Then it suddenly comes and goes.
Yeah, it comes and goes. Yes.
Hello. Because I can hear you guys very clearly, so it's definitely a problem from my end.
I think it's the mic. Yes. Yeah. Try again, please. Try again.
Hello. So, can you hear me now?
You need to keep talking, so just to make sure that you're not drifting out again.
Right, so let me go ahead and I hope the volume is consistent.
No.
No, gone completely.
Yeah, gone completely.
Hello. I'm very sorry about the setup.
Maybe he could just keep going, and he does the best he can.
Yeah, is there another mic? You know, maybe use the mic of the laptop or the desktop or whatever you're using.
Yeah, right next to the mic, actually.
Okay, I mean, just go ahead. Go ahead. I mean, we do whatever we can.
I apologize. This is my first Zoom meeting that I'm doing, and yeah. Anyway, so here now we look at the different type of conflict events and see which events were most affected by introduction of these lockdown policies, and we find that the effect is primarily driven by a significant about 10 percentage point decline in protest activity globally, and there's also some decline in overall violence against civilians across countries. Next, we parse the data and we see across different kind of actors, which actors were most affected by these imposition of lockdown policies. And once again, we find that this effect is primarily driven by incidents involving protesters and some incidents involving political militias. Although there is no effect on incidences that involve state forces or the ones involving rioters or rebel groups. Finally, we also look across country characteristics to break down which country characteristics might mediate the effect of these lockdown policies on conflict outcomes. And we find that there is a significant reduction or in conflict outcomes in countries with low religious structuralization, whereas there is not much decline in countries with a high religious structuralization. Furthermore, in countries that with high GDP per capita, we find there's a very significant decline in conflict events in these countries, whereas we actually find there's a slight increase in the number of conflict events or conflict incidents in countries with low GDP per capita. So to summarize the different results, once again, we find that countries that have a high level of religious fractionalization, they do not experience a reduction in violence. However, countries with low level of religious fractionalization, they experience a significant decline in violence against civilians. Furthermore, these effects are mostly driven by events that involve civilians and state forces. And furthermore, we find that this heterogeneity of conflict response with respect to income is mostly driven by the dynamics of protests, which, as I highlighted earlier, that is suggestive that in countries with low GDP per capita, there might be actually an increase in protest activity following the imposition of these lockdown measures. So finally, to discuss and to put all these results into perspective, these results point to several potential mechanisms. First of all, by reducing mobility, these restrictions impact mobilization capacity of individuals, which explains the high decline in the protest activity worldwide. However, we don't observe such a decline of protests in countries with very low income, which suggests that the economic effect of shutdown and lockdown policies might have triggered additional, mostly peaceful conflict. Furthermore, we find that these shutdown policies may have limited the capacity of low-income states to fight off against the rebel opposition. Finally, we find that there is this effect on violence against civilians in more religious fractionalized countries, which suggests that this effect of decline in violence against civilians could have been tempered by a rise in inter-religious and inter-ethnic violence against minorities, which suggests that the epidemics may have intensified underlying ethnic or religious tensions, which could lead to scapegoating of minorities. Yeah, so that's all I have.
Thank you, Rohit. Unfortunately, this happened with the Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay. Unfortunately, yes, these things happen. Let me go to questions, please. Tushar has got a question to ask. Tushar, would you like to ask the question yourself, or?
Sure. And is that, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can. Yes.
All right, perfect. So my main question is, if you go through the conflict literature, there's always this economic argument: the opportunity cost of rising or joining the conflict is a key determinant. And if anything, the lockdown decreases the opportunity cost of joining a conflict.
Right.
So I would expect the conflict to rise. And David pointed out that the conflicts or the protests that you see in the US, the Black Lives Matter protests in particular, they wouldn't have been as large had it not been for the COVID making a lot of people unemployed. And so how do you reconcile that with the results that you have?
Tushar, thank you for your question. So as I suggested, that there might be various different mechanisms in conflict literature through which these income shocks could be affecting outcomes, especially pertaining to violence, to protests. The main effect we think is coming from this. The problem is the opportunity. This collective action problem. So if you have to organize a group of people who come together and protest against the state in demanding for something, but you still have a moral hazard problem where people who don't even protest or who don't participate in protest may actually also benefit for any kind of policy action that might take place. And as we see in the results, until April 18th, that's when we have these we have the conflict data for. We actually don't find that globally there's a sharp decline in protest activity worldwide. It would be interesting to see once we start looking at May data. Could it be possible that these organizational effects were affected by you require just one particular instance for people to overcome this kind of a collective action problem and join together in protesting. So that would be interesting.
Thank you.
Hello?
Thank you. David, would you like to go next?
Yeah, this is the Google mobility data, which that people who don't have GPS cell phones wouldn't be here. So I don't know, I was like in Ethiopia a few years ago, and the Oromos were burning down cars and factories, and they were really upset about lack of representation. I'm sure some of the protest leaders had that. I don't know. I don't know to what extent that applies here, or whether the conflict data is kind of independent. There's a measurement question more than a comment. To what extent do you think that there's missing protests and conflict and stuff because of the measurement? It's a clarifying question more than anything else.
So actually, we did look for. We actually introduced these mobility measures as well, and we did not find any significant effect on the outcomes depending on mobility, local mobility.
Okay.
It's yeah. So one thing about the measurement, we do account for the reportage, which could be one reason why some of these outcomes might be underreported. But once again, we did not find any significant effect of press freedom and its effect on conflict dynamics following the lockdown.
I see. So the press freedom thing was partly to address the issue of there could just be places where there's conflict, but somebody's cracking down on it and you don't know about it. That's like the Ethiopia example where it was kept under wraps. Got it. Let me just add to what Tushar said before, that since it was a related comment. I don't think this paper would be less interesting if you update the data and you find that in April things were less likely to be, there's less likely to be protests, but in June it's more likely. I mean, I think that it's kind of a very different world in April than it was in June. Things were just starting. People were really scared. They wanted to stay home. I think that people are sick of being on lockdown, and like in the U.S., they're sick of the politics and the police and stuff. So if you update the data and find that things are different in earlier and later periods, that's interesting too.
I agree. Actually, I think it would be interesting to see. As I said, you just require one spark. Maybe it's some kind of your religious leader or your political leader who are able to solve a collective action problem, and this might have changed over in May and June. Yes, I agree.
I mean, related to what David said about the data, there's a point that Aidan makes about the ACLED data. They collect data from newspaper articles. So there might be hidden protests that you're not picking up with the data you're using. I guess that's the point. So maybe you want to look at that data as well.
As I said, I
haven't read the point, but Aidan says that ACLD collates data from newspaper articles. Okay.
Right. So one thing to account for any kind of differences in how there might be a reporting bias across countries was to actually control for these press freedom differences across countries. And we actually don't find any kind of significant effect in terms of the reporting quality and how it's affecting conflict outcomes.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, that's it. It brings the proceedings to a conclusion.